welcome to the video lecture for Chapter 21, Opera in the Early Classical Period. Now, this is basically, as we've talked about in class, usually called the pre-classic era or sometimes called the Rococo. It's a very important period, as talked about in Chapter 20. A lot of new developments come along. Vocally speaking, one of the most important developments is the development of comic opera. Instrumentally speaking, as we'll talk about in Chapter 22, we see the development of the symphony and the modern form of the concerto and sonata take place. So, essentially, what starts happening in the 1720s and 1730s is some new styles develop in opera. Now, opera seria, or serious opera, which is basically what opera had been up to that point, was very locked into tradition. Even though it had only been around for a bit over 100 years, it was very much locked into the traditional way of doing things as far as the format, the recitative aria structure, the fact that it was in Italian no matter who composed the opera and what country it was composed in, it was always in Italian. Comic opera came along, developed as we go through the late 1600s into the 1700s. Every country had its own tradition of comic opera, and comic opera was a lot less formal. It wasn't performed at the courts of the nobility. It wasn't paid for by the wealthy necessarily, so much so there was a lot more freedom to experiment with some of the new innovations. Regardless of what kind of opera we're talking about, the emphasis in this period is always on the melody. If you think back to what we talked about with late mid-Baroque opera, the emphasis on arias, the prima donna, and the lead singer got to sing the most arias and the most difficult arias. So, these different comic opera styles. The first one we're going to talk about is in Italy, and it is referred to as opera buffa. Opera buffa is a full-length opera, sung throughout, no spoken dialogue, all sung, recitatives, arias, ensembles, choruses, usually had at least 6 characters in it, and the plots were entertaining. But even though they were entertaining, there was always a moral at the end of it. The audience could walk away, oh, I learned something here. So I guess it was an attempt to teach through entertainment, as you will. It's not so much like opera seria, of course, based many of them in old Greek, Roman mythologies and dramas that were, I won't say less enjoyable, but certainly a lot less lighthearted entertainment. Usually these plots centered on ordinary people. We're not talking about gods, we're not talking about legends, just ordinary human beings, and it focused on their, everyone's got their quirks, right? Most people, relationships, a lot of these operas tended to center around misunderstandings within relationships and things like that. Stuff that everyone can identify with. It wasn't unusual, by the way, to make fun of the nobility in these comic operas, which is one reason why, of course, they weren't performed at the courts of the nobility. In class, we're going to listen to, follow along with, and then watch a video clip of an aria from La Serva Padrona, The Maid as Mistress. This is by the composer Pergolesi, Giovanni Battista Pergolesi. Very important composer of his time. Opera is also some instrumental music, and some of that music has survived to this day. Now, this was an intermezzo. The intermezzo was not a full-length opera, but actually an intermezzo was a short opera that was performed during the intermissions of opera seria. So you'd have your first act of a serious opera, and then during the intermission, you would have a small-scale comic opera performed as light entertainment during the extended intermission. Usually, intermezzos only had 2 or 3 characters, and they were quite short. In this particular one, so it's a really funny opera, there are 3 characters, one of whom never speaks or sings. So there are only 2 singing roles. The plot of it is essentially a woman who is a maid to a very wealthy man. She manages to convince him that she's got someone interested in her, in an attempt to make him jealous, so eventually they get married, and she winds up moving from the maid to the mistress of the manor, if you will. Comic opera coming out of Italy, a lot of the characteristics we're going to see in this opera carried over into other operatic comic opera traditions. Going on at the same time as comic opera, as I've referred to, we have opera seria. Now, during this period, it becomes quite formulaic. Pietro Metastasio, who was an Italian poet, came up with the structure. He wrote many librettos. Composers took a lot of the libretti that he wrote and set them to music. It wasn't unusual for multiple composers to use the same librettos by Metastasio. They were performed all over Europe in important centers of opera throughout Europe. I believe Mozart even used Metastasio libretto or two during his composing career. There's Metastasio. In the form of opera seria that has developed now in the latter part of the Baroque, into the pre-classic era, we can see, I've talked about this in class, this is where it really becomes structured. Recitatives, because of the fact that they tend to be syllabic and easily understood, that's where you can fit a lot of dialogue. You fit a lot of dialogue into your recitatives, and that's where the plot is advanced. You tell the story through the dialogue of the recitative, usually simple recitative. Occasionally they'll use an accompanied recitative for particularly dramatic moments. If you think back to the Handel oratorio we listened to, there was a simple recitative followed by an accompanied recitative that moved into a chorus. The arias tend to be emotional. They feature primary characters, and they're very dramatic. The primary form at this time was the da capo aria. A, B, and then at the end of the B section, the contrasting B section, you go back to the top, da capo, the A section, and the second time through the A section, you ornament it quite a bit with coloratura, with extensive passing tones, trills, additions of notes. In addition to your solo songs, the recitatives and arias, which are the most important things in the operas, far and away, opera of this period focused around the solo song. You occasionally see duets, larger ensembles, trios, quartets, etc., and choruses. The most important composer of opera seria at the time really is fairly obscure today. Johann Adolf Hasse, very, very important at his time, but honestly, I'm not sure if his music is really performed very often today. I'm familiar with at least one trombone piece, which is a transcription of several of Hasse's works, but I've personally have never seen one of his operas on the schedule. I'm not saying no one performs them, but they're certainly not performed with any kind of great regularity. However, having said that, and in his time, he was very, very important, and his primary source of text were librettos by Metastasio. So these two, Hasse and Metastasio, kind of combined to set what was going on in opera seria. Just to reiterate, opera seria, serious opera, very structured, very formal, and comic opera, in Italy known as opera buffa, tended to be much more free-flowing and be open to some new ideas. There we go. Took a second. Opera outside of Italy. Opera seria was performed all over Europe, all throughout Europe. From the development of opera, people began to perform opera everywhere. However, opera seria was a direct export from Italy, and it maintained all of its forms, characters, and even language when performed in other countries. Opera seria, when performed in Germany, when performed in France, when performed in England, still tended to almost always be in Italian and focus very much on these solo songs, these dramatic plots. Everything that we've seen goes on in Italy. Comic opera, throughout all of Europe, had differences. First of all, it was usually set in the vernacular. So, opera buffa in Italy was in Italian. But Singspiel, comic opera in Germany, was in German, and comic opera in England, ballad opera, was, of course, in English. In addition to that, they tended to write music that sounded more national. The French comic opera, opera comique, made use of French-inspired folk songs and things like that, because this is music written more for the common person. So the music that they wrote used a lot more of familiar folk songs and things like that, that the common people who would be going to see these operas could identify with. What's so important about comic opera? Well, comic opera, first of all, got away from kind of this overly complex coloratura writing that was going into opera seria, and kind of led towards a more natural sounding use of the voice and more natural sounding writing of the language. In addition, it set the stage for national opera traditions. Eventually, we see serious opera being composed in all countries in the vernacular. German composers by the Romantic era are writing serious operas in German. English composers are writing serious operas in English. In addition to that, serious operas begin to use more nationalistic idioms, be written and based more on, say, national folk tales, national legends, things like that. So, comic opera, no matter what country it was in, was very, very important in setting the stage for later developments. By the time we get to Mozart, Mozart wrote operas that were both comic and serious combined. Don Giovanni, if you're familiar with that opera, is a great example of that, because it's a very serious opera. It deals with rape and a man being pulled down into hell to be punished for his sins and things like that. But it's also really funny at times. I mean, there are a couple characters. Leporello is one of the funniest characters in all of opera. And there are some scenes that are really just drop-dead hilarious, if you speak Italian or have read the libretto. Okay, so back to comic opera. We've talked about opera buffa in Italy, which was all sung. Well, in France, opera comique began latter part of the Baroque era, around 1710 is when the first opera comiques were being written, tended to use popular tunes. Now in France, these popular tunes are known as vaudevilles. Vaudeville in America took on a different name, different meaning. Vaudeville was kind of a variety show that happened in America in the late 1800s into the 1900s that utilized singing and dancing acts and even trained animals like, dogs that do tricks and things like that. That's vaudeville in America during the time of the turn of the century, turn of the 1900s. In France, vaudeville was simply a term used to mean simple, popular songs. So comic opera in France, opera comique, used these simple, popular songs, and also, instead of recitative, used spoken dialogue to advance the story. These are the first steps to, eventually, in the 20th century, what became the American musical. Because if you think of the musical, be it West Side Story or Rent or any of the popular new musicals that come out, they have songs, but they also have a lot of spoken dialogue. Spoken dialogue advances the story instead of recitative. There we go. Now, in England, let me check this slide real quick. Yeah, thought I skipped a slide. For some reason the board's not working very well today. In England, this comic opera, known as opera buffa in Italy, known as opera comique in France, is known as ballad opera. Ballad operas were in English, in the vernacular, and they, just like the French comic opera, used spoken dialogue instead of recitative. Originally, kind of like French comic opera, instead of composing new songs, composers would take popular melodies that everyone knew, everyone could whistle, and they would set new lyrics to them. Eventually, they began to write their own original songs. So, ballad opera in England is actually very similar to opera comique, French comic opera, use of spoken dialogue to advance the story, and originally use of simple popular songs with new lyrics. Now, we're going to listen to an example from this in class The Beggar's Opera, which was composed in 1728. You can say it was composed, but it wasn't really, because they didn't write original music. They took popular songs and set new lyrics to them. John Gay and Johann Pepusch are the two who collaborated on this. Gay is credited frequently with the music, Pepusch with the lyrics, although of course they both contributed in both ways, I believe. The Beggar's Opera is one of the most popular operas ever written in England. It was hugely popular and very, very successful, to the point that 200 years after it was written in the 20th century, a German composer named Kurt Weill took the libretto from the Beggar's Opera and set it to newly composed music and called it the Threepenny Opera. It's a very famous song from the Threepenny Opera titled Mac the Knife. You'd recognize the song if you heard it. So the Beggar's Opera has been around for getting close to 300 years now and has maintained its popularity. Now, one reason why it was so popular is very funny, and it really made fun of the class system in England. If you've ever read or seen an adaptation of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, the main characters are orphans and kids who live in the street who are pickpockets and thieves and things like that, and ladies of the evening, as they call them, whores. So these are the characters in the Beggar's Opera: thieves, prostitutes, and it really makes fun of society in London, and it also makes fun of serious opera by having these low-class characters be treated in the same way that high-class characters would be treated in a serious opera. So you can see why it was so tremendously popular, because it made fun of the wealthy, it made fun of the poor, and it made fun of serious opera, all set to popular songs that people were whistling. So it's obvious why it was very popular immediately, and it's maintained its popularity, as I said, for getting close to 300 years now. Now, in Germany and Austria, right around the same time that opera comique was popping up in France, Singspiel popped up in German. Singspiel literally translates as singing play, or a play that is sung, and just like ballad opera in England and opera comique in France, it mixes songs, arias, with spoken dialogue. The plot is advanced in spoken dialogue. Also, of course, the plot is comic, is funny. So, what we have here, wait on this one. What we have going on, all more or less simultaneously in the late part of the Baroque, getting into the pre-classic, we have opera buffa in Italy, we have opera comique in France, we have ballad opera in England, we have Singspiel in Germany and opera. All comic opera. All operas that make fun, frequently, of the nobility, that have comic plots, that feature fun, singable music, and in all cases, use spoken dialogue instead of recitative, except for opera buffa. Remember, in Italy, opera buffa, you still use recitative. So, as we go on through this period, getting closer and closer to the classical period, we begin a period of opera reform. Many composers and librettists started to think that opera seria was way too stuffy. It was too locked into traditions, that the formulas that you had to use for your plots and your dialogue and your music were not natural sounding. The characters weren't natural, were not identifiable, and the text was not usually identifiable and easily said. So what they wanted is, these opera reformers wanted to start to write music where they could modify the structures of the recitatives and arias so it sounded more natural, sounded more like people would speak. They wanted to use the orchestra more, instead of using the orchestra as just a basic accompaniment for the singers. They wanted to use the orchestra more. They also wanted more choruses instead of everything. You can see where the reform is going. Opera had moved to a point where it was focused entirely on the solo voice, with just tiny amounts of other things going on, but it was all about the prima donna and the prima donne, the lead female vocalist, the lead male vocalist. These these opera reformers wanted opera to open up again, have more choruses, have more use of the orchestra, and just be more natural. One of the most important opera reformers is Gluck, Christoph Willibald Gluck. Now, Gluck was born in Bohemia, present-day Czechoslovakia, or Czech Republic now. In those days was a region known as Bohemia. He traveled throughout Europe and learned from all of these different musical styles. He was very influenced by the movement of opera reformers that was happening in Italy. So Gluck decided that he wanted to create a more natural sounding opera. Still opera seria. You know, the opera reformers were not intending to write comic opera. They just wanted to write opera seria that was not so locked down in the way it had been done. So the result of this, Gluck wrote quite a few operas. He managed to do all these things we talked about, put a little more emphasis on the orchestra, more emphasis on the choruses, de-emphasize the solo voice to some extent, and be a little freer in his structure so his operas were more natural. It was very influential, especially in France. Gluck's operas were popular in France, and they kind of set the stage for the next generation of opera composers. It's a well-known portrait of Gluck, not holding a piece of music, but he is, however, sitting at a keyboard instrument. Meanwhile, while all of this was happening in opera, people were composing other vocal music as well. So, first, solo songs. People were writing solo songs. They tended to be very simple, tended to be strophic, simple melodies that were syllabic and diatonic. None of this chromaticism that we heard coming out of Italy in the 1600s. Why? Oh, and the accompaniment was usually quite simple, simple enough that you could actually play it at the piano while you were singing the songs. A lot of these songs were written with the amateur music maker in mind. They were written for people to sing at home. So since they were going to be sung at home, they were strophic, so they were easy to learn, syllabic, easier to sing, diatonic, easier to learn and remember the melodies, and simple accompaniment so that you could play it or someone else in your house would be able to play it. And this is very popular throughout Europe, this movement into solo song. This eventually led to a style of song that got to be very important, the Lied. Lied is simply the German word for song. Now, when we think of Lied, German Lied, or Lieder as the plural, we think of romantic music, music by Schubert and Schumann and Brahms. And that is where the word Lied is most closely identified. But the style actually began in the pre-classical era, in the second half of the 1700s, pre-classical era into the classical era. During this time, over 750 collections of Lieder by various composers were published. Again, they were strophic, they were easy to sing, and they were supported by a simple accompaniment. If you think about, well, we'll get to the Romantic era in the spring, but the Lied kind of changed in the Romantic era a little bit, especially as far as the accompaniments tended to get much more complex, and the forms changed also. They weren't always strophic. Some of them were still strophic, but not always. Important composers of the German Lied, well, Telemann. We've talked about Telemann and his importance as an instrumental composer. In his time, he was considered by the people to be a greater composer than Bach. He was also important for his Lied, C.P.E. Bach, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, who we're going to talk about in more detail when we talk about instrumental music. He was one of the sons of J.S. Bach, who became very important. And a little lesser known composer, Karl Heinrich Gramm. He was very important in the development of the German Lied, and some of his music is still sung today, but certainly he does not have the name recognition of Telemann, C.P.E. Bach, or some of the later composers. Now, I'm specifically jumping to America in the 1700s for this reason. Obviously, for the first couple hundred years that Europeans had colonized America, pretty much all of their culture was imported. Their music and most of what else was going on was simply the stuff that was happening in Europe that eventually made it to America, usually years after the fact. America was hopelessly behind in terms of style and things like that. But in the second half of the 1700s, during the pre-classic into the classical era, a composer came to his compositional maturity in America. His name was William Billings. And you can think of William Billings as being the first important American composer. He focused primarily on vocal music, and even beyond that, on sacred music. Now, he wrote over 340 compositions, as I said, almost all of them sacred vocal, most of them four-part a cappella music. Now, probably his most famous song that he ever wrote was called Chester. Chester was used as a hymn in the Revolutionary War. It was a song that was sung frequently in the Revolutionary War. It's about shaking off the bounds of tyranny. So you can see why it was very popular during the Revolutionary War. This made Billings a household name, and it's a song of his that has continued throughout the 200 plus years since it's been written. In the 20th century, a very, very important American composer named William Schumann, not to be confused with Robert Schumann, the German Romantic composer. William Schumann actually took this song, Chester, and he set it for orchestra and then later for concert band in a setting of his called New England Triptych. So this song, Chester, has continued to be important today, and we will listen to it in class. Two collections of his songs that are very important. The New England Psalm Singer, which was published in 1770, and in 1794, he published the Continental Harmony. So, I'm focusing on William Billings here, primarily because he is the first American composer to achieve any real importance. His importance was more or less stayed to America. People in Europe were not necessarily singing William Billings songs. That doesn't begin to happen until later in the mid-1800s, where American composers' music begins to get performed around the world. But Billings, important composer. So this is some of what was happening in opera and in vocal music, solo vocal music, and choral music during the pre-classical era. We have opera seria, locked into a very specific structure, and then eventually the opera reformers came along, typified by Gluck, who wanted to open serious opera up and make it more natural sounding and utilize choruses and orchestra more. Meanwhile, we have this comic opera tradition growing up, opera buffa in Italy, opera comique in France, Singspiel in Germany and Austria, and ballad opera in England, all of which tended to be comic, shorter, funny plots, in the vernacular, in the whatever the local language was, and to utilize spoken dialogue, except for opera buffa. And then we see going on solo songs being written throughout Europe, focusing primarily on amateur singers. And then in America, we see the rise of William Billings, the first important American composer. Next chapter, chapter 22, is going to focus on what happens in instrumental music during the pre-classical era.